My name is Joanna Helms, and I am the Economic Development Director for the town of Apex. And I currently serve as your NCEDA president. Happy to be with you here today and be your MC for this EDPNC real estate report. And we're so glad that all of you are joining us. Before starting the program, I would like to acknowledge NCEDA's annual sponsors, whose logos you'll see on the screen now. These companies and organizations support every component of NCEDA's expansive mission and our growing body of programs. We thank all of these sponsors for their generous support. Webinars like this one that benefit our membership are a direct result of their support. So today we are going to be diving into the realm of real estate development and its significance on the communities and businesses in North Carolina. Today's presentation will equip you with insights and resources needed to navigate this landscape effectively. During the webinar, we'll explore the importance of understanding real estate trends and opportunities and how they can impact your community and businesses. We'll provide practical guidance on leveraging state-level data to make informed decisions and capitalize on emerging opportunities. Now, let's introduce our speaker, Austin Rouse. As the Director of Business Recruitment for the Economic Development Partnership of North Carolina, Austin is the driving force behind this webinar. With a remarkable history of successfully overseeing a multitude of economic development projects leading to substantial job growth and capital investment, Austin brings invaluable insights into North Carolina's real estate market. His understanding of the state's real estate landscape and its impact on business strategies makes him an excellent resource for today's discussion. So we are delighted to have him join us today as, again, we're going to dive deeper into how the EDPNC can serve as a valuable resource for all of you. So let's get started. Austin, you have the floor, or should I say the screen is yours.
Thank you, Joanna, for that introduction, and I appreciate the opportunity, Liz, to have a little bit of insight share for what we're seeing at EDPNC. I always appreciate the ongoing support and partnership with NCEDA. So with that, I'll go through our real estate report and sort of give you some high insight, a little bit about the report, sort of the emphasis while we sort of track this information and hopefully give some key insights, and we'll be sure to leave a lot of room on the back end for some Q&A. So hopefully it leads to discussion. But ultimately, our purpose for providing this information is we started this in 2019 for providing this for information as far back as sort of the 2018 project activity has. So we've got a good historical lens through which we've been doing this report. A special shout out to a few of our team members at EDPNC that have been really instrumental for making this report possible and really getting into the weeds to clean up the data that's really required to make it worthwhile and meaningful for today. So one, I'd like to thank Olivia Kuhn. Olivia's on our team at EDPNC and has been working several years now on this report. So she has been the main person that's behind a lot of the information that is included in here and enhancing it over the years. So excited that Olivia's, I think, joining us today as well. And then a few other of our team members that are responsible for putting in information. So our business recruitment team, our existing industry team, who we really emphasize the importance of the information and communicating with our local partners in private sector investments and people who are interested in following real estate trends at a state level. So with that, I'll dive into the report. So hopefully you all can see the screen now. And we'll get started at a high level with activity. So we got two slides that sort of discuss overall what we're seeing across our entire business recruitment and existing industry team. So I oversee the business recruitment team while Bill Slave oversees our existing industry team. And for 2023, we had approximately, you see there 387 projects that sort of came to us. And you can see where they're divided as far as industry sector as well. So you'll see by far manufacturing is the predominant industry sector that we see activity and sort of activity that we have in the state. This is no surprise. This has been ongoing for several years now, particularly since the pandemic, where we've seen a major uptick in what our pipeline looks like as far as the percentage of manufacturing projects, accompanied with obviously sizable portion of warehouse distribution projects as well. Next, you'll just sort of see a quick division of like whether or not they're new location project or on-site expansions. Interestingly enough, when Olivia was pulling the data, she discovered that we had the exact same amount of new location projects in 2023 as we did in 2022. So what we would describe at EDPNC is we saw record-breaking activity as far as just overall people's interest in the state in 21 and 22, and a lot of record-breaking announcements. We saw that same level of project activity as far as total number of projects in our pipeline last year as well. Interestingly enough, we saw a pretty sharp decline in the existing industry number of projects. So those on-site expansion opportunities, that's about a 40% less than what we had seen in the previous year in 2022 for on-site expansion. So obviously, clearly people that were contemplating on-site were very much in a holding pattern compared to previous years, because we had never seen that type of volatility in our data from previous collections over the years with this report. Next, I'll get focused on the projects that are new location projects. So these are companies that do not have a presence with that type of particular operation. It's not an on-site expansion. So we're talking about truly new projects that are considering the state. And here's an overview of that pipeline. It primarily reflects what you saw on the first slide, but there's a few nuances there where you'll see some differences in overall activity across the state. Here, we just like to give you a good sense of, hey, across this activity, what's the normal project look like? What are we typically seeing when we describe a manufacturing looking at this state? So here you can see, for that 80+% of our pipeline, approaching 85% manufacturing, the average project is around 170 jobs, 50 million investment, median wages in the mid-50s, which I think a lot of our communities would be quite excited about having that opportunity in their community. So that's the vast majority of what our pipeline looks like. That's what the median project looks like at EDPNC. You see that accompanied with sort of the other activity that we're seeing across the state. You can see what those average type of projects look like as well. No surprise, you see corporate headquarters with the higher wage, lower capital investment as well. And then surprisingly enough, we had a number of meaningful projects in the service and sales industry as well, with a higher capital investment than what I would have anticipated looking at the data from previous years. Next, we'll sort of go uncover and give you a little bit insight of like, hey, where are these projects coming from, and what is EDPNC's involvement with facilitating those projects coming to the state look like? So this is something that our leadership's been touting, I believe, for a good solid year now, because I think we started seeing in our data last year that EDPNC leads and internal referrals were becoming our primary source of new location projects looking at the state. So that represents an uptick over the years. And I think that's a really strong indication of our marketing efforts, as well as our business development efforts, and those two partnering to enhance that slowly, advancing beyond site selection consultant as our number one source of projects. And give you a sense, that's a pretty diverse mixture of those 113 projects. They come from our marketing campaign, trade shows, internal referrals, which is our business development team, comes from our international offices, as well as just web generation. People come to our website and interested in learning more about the state. But overall, we're encouraged by that, because obviously a lot of you all know that we've received significant support from the General Assembly, as well as been bolstering our business development team over the past 3 or 4 years. So we're really starting to see the benefit of that in our project pipeline, and continues to put more companies having North Carolina top of mind when they're going through their site selection process. Next, I'll just give you this is probably where we start to get more detailed with our information that we collect, outlining real estate trends and sort of industry trends. Noticeable here is obviously you'll see automotive motor vehicles, which, for better or worse, that's basically capturing the EV, electric vehicle activity we're seeing in the battery supply chain. So we don't differentiate EV related projects to overall automotive motor vehicles, but essentially you can say that is our EV battery supply chain, because that's the vast majority of those projects, along with some traditional automotive suppliers, but that's a pretty small percentage of that 50 projects we saw in our pipeline last year. And then energy. So energy, broadly speaking, think battery storage, think solar, think all the supply chain related to those, as well as increasingly, you all have seen the level of federal activity over the past few years that's really accelerated the movement towards clean energy. So those two leading sectors by far, along with, you'll see here, well-established sectors in the state: food, beverage, and agriculture, chemical and plastics, construction materials, biotech, and life sciences being the four after that. So you'll see that's pretty consistent, that those four are pretty active in the state. But the clear uptick in EVs and energy. EVs been something that we've obviously seen since 2021 as a state. It's obviously very top of mind and you see routinely, but increasingly energy was the first time where it really advanced in our project pipeline. And I'll touch on the fact that that was really a 2023 trend that we saw. I was pulling late last night some information about, hey, what does our 2024 pipeline look like? And there was a remarkable downtick in activity that we were seeing in the energy sector. So, for example, it was obviously 15% of our pipeline last year. It's now around 8% of our pipeline this year, energy projects. While on the flip side of that, EVs were 16% of our project pipeline last year. So far, they're around 20% of our project pipeline. And for so far in 2024, we've also seen an uptick in life sciences activity, as well as sort of textiles and apparel, sporting goods, so a traditional industry that for some reasons had a little resurgence here for the first 5.5 months of the year at EDPNC. And then here just gives you, similar to what we were describing as far as activity, what does that average project look like? Here, we're just trying to say, hey, what does the median project look like for these industry sectors? So just good information that when, obviously a lot of people are targeting certain industries within their communities and trying to understand what does a typical EDPNC project look like within sector? Hopefully this is good information for you to have on hand to relay to your leadership, and something that we're always glad to provide some additional information around if needed to be helpful, to give you a little more granular sense of what those project opportunities look like and the accompanying real estate requirements that I'll dive into a little bit more in just a second. So here's just a slide sort of describing at a high level those two leading sectors that we're seeing in our pipeline, and sort of some of the more detailed requirements we're seeing around those. Because those typically, as you'll see here with some of the real estate, are more substantial projects, and obviously the reason why we've been seeking support through the legislature for some of our product development initiatives that have been stood up at EDPNC as well. So this just gives you a clear line of sight into what we're seeing as far as what are the utility needs of those projects, as well as what their overall sort of real estate requirement need. But that's just a few high level things we'll just mention there that you'll see in the data there. Here's just a deeper dive into the clean energy sector. So for us, you'll see here, this is pretty much an extension of what you saw in a few slides before, but just a little bit more under the hood of what we're seeing there. As far as when we're talking about clean energy, which is a subsector that we track specifically at EDPNC to try to have a firmer grasp of that, as we continue to see that being the primary type of projects we're seeing at EDPNC and being at least probably 30% of our project pipeline. So it's just very top of mind for us to capture as much information as possible about these clean energy projects in our pipeline. Speaking about our sort of sourcing efforts earlier, this is a slide that if we would have shown you obviously in the peak of the pandemic or the first year or two after, would have obviously been not nearly as internationally driven. So that's something that we're excited to see, that obviously there was some pent-up demand in last year's report from 2022 being the first year that a lot of international companies could get over here, visit, start their site selection process, move forward in some clear next steps on their end. And we've continued to see that accelerate this year with, half of our projects having some source of the ultimate parent company being international. So obviously for us, that varies whether or not we're dealing with the international team or we're dealing with their domestic counterparts at a leadership level. But nonetheless, we're seeing foreign direct investment increasingly be a huge driver and a major uptick over that. And that's been continued throughout the early part of our data for 2024 as well. So continue to be encouraged by the state strengthening its relationships across the globe. And we'll dive into the next slides that gives you a clear sense of, hey, where are those places that are most often looking at North Carolina from an international perspective. So with that, you'll see for new location projects last year in those FDI countries, China's at the top of the list, along with Germany. And then we have a pretty steep drop off to where it gets into the vast majority of the countries are anywhere between 5 or 10 projects that we saw last year, from, as you'll see here, represented. Obviously, China's very top of mind. It's something that obviously I think many of you know that we evaluate on a case-by-case basis at the state. And so that uptick, I will say, has really impacted our work, as a lot of those companies were very fast moving, were coming quickly to the state, and were looking to really move forward as expeditiously as possible as they were sort of going through their site selection process. I will say so far in 2024, we've seen a noticeable downtick of that. So, like, for example, through the first part of this year, we've only seen 3 Chinese projects, but along those same vein, we also saw a downtick in Germany projects. We only had a few projects so far from Germany that have entered our pipeline in 2024, and then also a sharp downtick as well for Korea and Canada as well. So, but with that, we've seen an uptick in 2024 of projects from the UK, Italy, as well as India. So, needless to say, some of that's probably maybe just early year noise for 2024, but needless to say, this is what our project pipeline looked like pivoting back to 2023. And here just gives you a sense of, like, hey, when companies approach us and we get involved with projects, you know, in 2023, you know, about 64% of those we were involved with their site selection process. We were helping identify real estate. And that was even remarkably higher for those projects that were manufacturing locations. So a lot of companies rely on us, obviously, for what we do, industrial recruitment, to help them navigate and find real estate options throughout the state. But at a high level, this has increased even more in 2024. So we're closer to 78% of companies reaching out to us with wanting us to help facilitate their real estate search. So this is something we sort of closely monitor, because for us, we're trying to identify, hey, the projects that we're sourcing, how often are we able to put options in front of clients, or how often do they come to us with a short list already established? So this gives you a clear sense of what those opportunities typically look like for us as far as being involved with that real estate assistance piece that's needed as companies navigate their site selection process. Here you'll see the most recent information for 2023, as well as some historical data to sort of compare it against, as far as, hey, when companies approach us, what are they looking for at that stage? Are they looking for building or site? So see, it was pretty evenly divided last year what companies were looking like, where in the past and that pretty closely mirrors what we saw in some previous years as well. But there's obviously some stark distinctions, where in 2021 we had almost half of the companies looking for buildings. That's pretty close to what we're seeing early in 2024 as well. So it's always interesting for us to track that information and get a sense of whether a building's top of mind, somebody's looking to move really quickly, or if they have, you know, a longer site selection process that lends itself towards them being willing to consider a greenfield site. But needless to say, this is what we're most recently seeing in 2020 as far as requests for building or site on our team. And then we'll start to sort of, in the next slide, give you a clearer sense of what the typical request is as far as square footage associated with those real estate requests. And here's where I'll say where our information gets diluted a little bit. You'll see less number of overall requests as we get more into the data, but typically we get really good information on their square footage needs, and then it gets less in details. You'll see some of the other slides that we track information as well. But overall, you can sort of do the quick math there. Around 60% of our projects are looking for under 200,000 square feet when they're going through their process. So we're talking about communities that are well situated to have, you know, buildings in their communities that are available that are between 50 and 200,000 square feet. That's, you know, where the majority of our clients are looking for real estate options. So, but you'll see that there's increasingly around 35% is over 200,000 square feet, and it's exceedingly rare that somebody asks us for a 1 million square foot building. Here just gives you a quick sense of what they're looking from a ceiling height perspective. So we like to track this information because oftentimes we get asked, hey, where's your activity and what are you seeing as far as requests? I think this is probably surprising to a lot of folks. And I would say this is probably representative of a lot of companies willing to make a concession on real estate hots and adjusting where their process is going to be laid out, when you see that there's as many companies willing to consider 16 feet or less or 20 feet or less when you're sort of looking at this data. But at the same time, obviously 30 feet is sort of the highest number of requests that we've had in terms of ceiling height minimum that they'd like to see at their operation. Next, we'll just sort of pivot to sites here and what we're seeing as far as overall sort of site requests. With this, less than 50 acres represents around 60% of our pipeline. But with that being said, we do have 40% of our pipeline that's looking for excess of 50 acres. So that's a significant portion. That's really why we think the continued efforts around product development across the state are really imperative, because we're seeing a lot of real estate requests that are in excess of 50 acres. But at the same time, obviously, 60% of those are less than 50 acres. So we saw that in our pipeline throughout 2023. Here's just sort of pivoting back to sort of, hey, what are companies typically looking to do as far as their openness to or preference to buy, lease, or buy or lease? I'd say if I were to look at historical data, this is probably where companies are a little bit more flexible than they have in the past, even for manufacturers. And I'd say that for the vast majority of our manufacturing projects. Obviously, the larger the project, less likely they are to want to lease or to make financial sense. But increasingly, companies that are wanting to be in key markets are willing to make some type of concessions, at least being open, at least initially, to buying or leasing a little bit more than they have in the past. I think our team would say. And here's just a little bit deeper dive specifically on natural gas, because obviously this is something that its availability sort of varies across the state, and obviously we're mindful at the state level on our end. But this gives you a quick sense of whether or not for natural gas specifically, do they need it, or do they not, or preference. And this is something we're specifically interested in tracking and how this evolves, as obviously we're seeing a lot of clean energy and EV related companies, and we've seen some of those companies that are unsure about, hey, what they want to look like as far as their energy mix. So we'll keep tabs on this in future reports as well, just to understand how that landscape sort of shifting as well. Similarly, we like to track, you'll see rail here in ports on the next slide, but like to give a sense of how often do our clients sort of prefer rail, need rail. And I think this is probably something we've continued to see an uptick, particularly on the site size of the need for rail in our project pipeline. So obviously you got strong partners that are continuing to bolster the product development initiatives around rail, including obviously North Carolina Railroad Company, as well as even CSX and Norfolk Southern, even some of the short lines are getting really active in enhancing their site development efforts. So we're excited to hopefully have more sites that are rail served or rail capable come into the state's mix, but we continue to see strong interest in that, particularly given the nature of projects, some of those industry sectors, it being pretty imperative for a lot of those sectors where they at least would like that optionality with rail. Similarly, we just like to say, hey, how often are we getting asked about the ports at the state level? Because obviously we've got the Wilmington port that's very well situated with extremely quick turnarounds. And something we increasingly like to sell, as well as being sandwiched around the better known ports across the eastern seaboard. So we sort of track this information to understand how often we're getting asked about the ports at the state level. But this just gives you a clearer sense of what that looks like and how that may vary between a building request versus a site request. And there's not much of a distinction there, as you can sort of see. Here's another piece that we get asked about. I'll say this is the piece that we've never clearly asked about on our team. So we most often it's sort of a company sort of has to opt in and tell us, hey, whether or not they're directly interested in some regards to site certification. But nonetheless, we have a lot of companies that are interested in knowing about if a site is going through some level of site certification or readiness. So we think this is increasingly important for communities to be conscious of as they make sure that, a lot of these companies are moving very quickly and need as much information on hand. And obviously a lot of those certification readiness programs sort of give a pretty clear pathway of what type of information most often is going to be requested by companies that are going through their site selection process. But we just track that. Hey, if they indicate some additional interest to us directly about site certification. or some readiness program, which obviously we have a number of partners across the state who are engaged in those efforts and continue to bolster those, which we're highly appreciative of at EDPNC. And then here's just a quick slide sort of pivoting back to the number of large projects that we sort of saw in our pipeline in 2023. So with this, you'll see that the vast majority of that was in our two leading sectors, so automotive as well as energy. I will say we're also seeing very similar amounts of activity, at least in the first 4.5 months compared to last year. So last year, you obviously see we saw 20 of these projects. So far, we've seen 6 or 7 of those projects in our pipeline. So you can get a quick sense of what those industries were that were willing to invest $1 billion or above. I will say, as far as the 2024 pipeline that has come to us of those 6 or 7 projects, the majority of those are automotive EV, and we have not seen an energy project yet that's $1 billion plus in capital investment. But obviously, would not be surprised if we saw one of those in the near future on our end. But that just gives you a quick sense of we're continuing to see this trend of really large scale projects that increasingly are driving decisions of companies, and hey, we've got a project this large, or we're having to react because there's projects like these locating in and around where we're contemplating, and we need to understand what that landscape looks like as we're looking across, most often the Southeast, given the major uptick in EV activity, semiconductor activity, as well as sort of all clean energy related efforts. So needless to say, this is a decrease from what we saw in 2022, as noted here, but still sizable activity that we saw for really large scale projects willing to invest $1 billion or above. And this will be sort of our last slide that we sort of capture information about, and then we'll turn over to Q&A. But for us, we just sort of like to keep track to the best extent we can. What are the reasons that somebody outlines that, they're no longer considering North Carolina, sort of cut us from their list? I will say this is something that's inherently really difficult for us to get firm, good information about. So I'll just say this is probably the thing I'd caveat the most when we're looking at information. But nonetheless, you'll see here we consistently see in our information the lack of suitable building or site is most often when we get cut in the site selection process, as well as outside of the search area, which most often means that somebody comes to us, they're looking at a lot of states, and then as they sort of further refine their process, they just realize that the location available in North Carolina doesn't make sense compared to their other options, whether or not that's proximity to suppliers, proximity to infrastructure, et cetera. We see a lot of that once we sort of get that initial pass and initial RFI or conversation with the company. And then increasingly, what I'd say probably is an uptick if I were to look at previous years, are probably inadequate infrastructure and incentives. So I think that specifically speaks to, we're seeing a really competitive landscape out there, and those investments in maintaining tools in our toolbox related to infrastructure support and incentives are really important as a state. So I think those are one things I'd also just draw your attention to when you're looking at that slide as well. That's something that I imagine probably looking at slight uptick as well. And we're looking at the overall competitive landscape for economic development as well. So anyway, that's just a brief insight about some of the feedback we get from a subset of our overall projects, where we get information about loss, and obviously a lot of projects go on cancel or get hold as well. So anyways, that's just a high level overview of the report itself. A few additional items I'd just like to reference. If there's additional information you would like to know in more detail, we are more than happy to share that with folks that are interested in additional levels of detail about the report and walk you through that. That's something that we commonly get asked to do, particularly by local communities as they're meeting with their leadership around, hey, we're having conversations about public-private partnerships, public leadership. I mean, as far as just spec building or not in our communities, and just having those conversations. So we're always eager to support communities and provide the most updated information we have. Obviously, most of it's kept at a state level. We don't have an easy way to break it down geographically across the state. But nonetheless, just want to make sure that people are conscious that, hey, we're always willing to support people that are trying to bolster their efforts. They can use the information here for their own purposes, particularly in the local government sector as well. So that's another key takeaway. I just want people to believe, hey, this is just sort of something that we also send out on a quarterly basis. We give a high level of some of these items. But we don't obviously provide this much detail until we do this full report at the end of the year on our end. So I'll stop there and see what questions there are. So I see there are a few.
Yes, so thank you so much, Austin. That was some really great information, and we really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and your experience with us. And so, yes, we have come to the time now for Q&A, where you can ask Austin directly some questions. Again, just type in those questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box. And so we already have a couple, and I'll just walk through those for you rather. I'll answer one myself because I can let folks know that you will be, or that rather the question is, can we get a copy of the deck of this or this recording? We do record all of our webinars, and we typically offer the slide deck to attendees either via a direct email or on our website, where we list our events, and then we have a recap of our events, including agendas, slide decks, etc. So yes, you will definitely have access to the slide deck following this webinar. Okay, so the first question I see is, Austin, is it safe to say that the demand for larger development sites within the state is still high? If so, is this expected to continue?
Yes, I would say there's still high interest in large scale development sites that we're seeing at the state level. It's something I'm really interested in seeing how that evolves as we get closer to the election. I mean, obviously there's pretty strong distinctions as far as viewpoint, as far as what's primarily fueled our large product pipeline has been obviously those leading sectors. And obviously there's contrasting visions with the 2024 election about the role of federal industrial policy in regards to that. So, but no, we are still seeing substantial interest in large scale sites. I'd say increasingly it's further in the supply chain, particularly the automotive sector. So in 21 and 22, what you primarily saw were EV manufacturers, as well as the battery manufacturing projects. I mean, those were the ones where you saw announced throughout the country. We were obviously fortunate to have a few of those announced in our state in recent years. And now you get further into those large scale components, those large scale operations. But yes, we expect that to continue. And I think overall, you've seen a number of those sectors sort of have slower ramp in phases of their investments that they outlined in 21 or 22, which I think gives a good chance for us to sort of catch our breath, hopefully get some new sites on the market. So as they sort of look about, hey, what is our site selection needs going to be over the next 5 to 10 years? I think we'll continue to see strong interest, but hopefully it won't be as sort of condensed as it was in 2022 in the future. Yeah. But overall, we're seeing good activity, interest in our larger sites.
Absolutely. Next question is, do you all categorize battery projects into auto or the energy category?
Yes. So, well, for battery projects, if they're battery tied to the automotive industry specifically, they get associated with automotive. If they're more battery storage or other sort of, application, they get categorized under energy. So easiest example is we oftentimes have battery storage projects that come to us, or something in the supply chain. They most often get captured underneath energy. But that's sort of the distinction we sort of make on our end. Hey, what's the ultimate industry that they're going to serve? If it's automotive, we go toward that. If it's just broadly speaking energy, and a more diverse set of applications, we put underneath the energy sector. Our team does.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's good to know. Next question is, what is the amount of projects that don't move forward, or rather that didn't move forward and are not marked as lost or won? Lost or won.
So I'd say I'd have to probably look at the data and get probably a good response to you on that. But I'd say it's 20 to 25% of our projects if I were to bet. But that's sort of first blush sort of assessment on that. And some of those we get clear understanding of like why they're canceled. Some it's sort of like they're long-term on hold and then they sort of drag on, and maybe they actually do perk back up as a project in a different form or the same form. But I'd say I'd probably put it at 20 to 25% of what we see in our overall project pipeline. But glad to follow up some additional information for the person who asked that question as well.
Yeah, I'd say that tracks with what I see here at a local level as well. So thank you for that. Now, how are you seeing prospects reacting or responding to brownfield sites?
I think there's more a receptiveness to brownfield sites. I'll say specifically what we've seen is an uptick, and I think particularly this past year and even late into 2022, there's a number of federal programs that are really encouraging activity around brownfield sites. I think some of you may be familiar with some of the MAPS that are aligned to some of the grant and loan programs where there's increasingly emphasis to go towards those types. So we've seen increasing interest with those few industrial sites that are in those areas. So that's what I immediately go to when I say, hey, brownfields, we've seen an uptick in interest, but obviously it's a pretty limited number of places that specifically fall into those federal areas. But I think there's more willing for companies to consider a brownfield as long as it has what you would expect. You know, it's got a brownfields agreement in place. It's got all that due diligence that's been done so that you can pretty quickly outline, here's what the issue was on site or adjacent to it. And it's clear to a company that they know what has been done up until that point. But I think we've seen an uptick in sort of interest in brownfield sites. There's a few sites that are top of mind where we've seen some activity, because at the same time, brownfield sites oftentimes can have some of that utility infrastructure already in place that potentially maybe can enable a company to move forward a little bit sooner, later, give a little more comfort that the infrastructure is already there. But I'd say we've seen an uptick in it. But obviously a lot of companies are still reticent about even going down the path, as many folks know. But an uptick, definitely an interest in it.
It can definitely be an education process for sure. Okay, next question is around incentives and just regarding projects that we may have lost due to incentives. Do you know what additional incentives they may have been looking for? For example, capital tax credits or workforce, or you know, just if it was an incentive, a loss due to an incentive, do you have any insight into maybe what they didn't receive from the state or were proposed from the state that may have tipped us over the edge?
Yeah, so it really is a case-by-case basis around incentives. But I'd say probably some trends that we're seeing is that I think overall, as a response to all these really, really large-scale projects, companies' expectations around incentives have really heightened. I mean, it's even more top of mind. They're having to make even stronger distinctions earlier on in the process for particularly those larger scale projects. And as those projects get larger, obviously states have got more aggressive in courting those. So I think we've just seen a lot of communities and states across the country enhance their toolbox. So increasingly, I'd say that there's probably a number of cases where we've just seen such a strong distinction because a community in a state would be so aggressive that we were just like, we're not willing to do that. I mean, that's a subset, but it's something that increasingly we see because you get communities that are really invested in the site or location to get a project, and they're just really willing to go over the top for it. But at the same time, I think increasingly, when we're talking about incentives, the fundamentals of things being increasingly clear to us. With one thing I'll say that you've seen us do at the state level in response to this, we've tried to bolster sort of our workforce and recruiting and screening resources and the way that's relayed in a state proposal. I think that's a direct response of companies want to have a very clear sense, as workforce is the most important item for many of these companies. What is the state's, what's the region, what's the community's approach to workforce, and how's that being supported and outlined directly through incentive support? So needless to say, those are just a few brief comments. We're talking about incentives and what that landscape looks like. The one thing I'll just also add, I've had for particularly medium to large scale projects, oftentimes our communities are having to walk through and do that process for the first time with their local elected officials about, here's our baseline level incentive policy. And it's like, okay, what's your community's comfort with going outside of that policy or outlining a policy that's sort of your version of a transformative policy? So we've had a number of communities across the state that have worked to do that as sort of the overall landscape and the types of projects we've seen evolve over the past few years. But those are just some initial thoughts for what we're seeing and what we're having to react to in the conversations we're having in regards to the incentives with companies. Because obviously, North Carolina's value proposition is, hey, we've got low taxes at the state level. Generally speaking, we've got very favorable property tax rates. So to some extent, we're having to constantly educate our clients on what that means from just an overall value proposition. Right. But I think we're all situated there, but we continue to see communities and states enhance their toolkits as they get a lot of them are eligible for federal money, and then they're have similar expectations around state money. It's a little bit different for what they're eligible for.
Right, absolutely. Do you have any data on the number of hydrogen-related projects in North Carolina?
So I would say it's been limited so far. So if we were to track that and break that out as a subsector of our clean energy related projects, we probably saw 3 to 4 hydrogen related projects. There was a flurry of those projects that sort of came through either in late 22 or early 2023. But I would say right now, I don't even think we have like a really, I mean, I hesitate to say we may have one or two that are hydrogen related right now, but it's a very small percentage of what we've seen since 2022. But we've definitely had some companies approach us with significant interest in it. But I think there was the hydrogen hub process that was done, and I don't think North Carolina, well, I know North Carolina wasn't one of those 7 hydrogen hubs that were indicated by the feds. So I think increasingly you're seeing activities concentrate in those places where that infrastructure is being built out, where things are being piloted, and where they're slowly building out an ecosystem, and just in the very early stages of it. So we're not seeing much hydrogen related activity in our pipeline.
Okay. Here's a question that's probably top of mind for several people. How much concern are you hearing about electricity regarding availability, capacity, redundancy, et cetera?
Yeah. So that's probably one thing we probably need to put in the slide to sort of outline what we're seeing and most often working with our partners at Duke, the co-ops, Electricities, and Dominion, because it's extremely top of mind. Increasingly, it's the initial question folks ask about where is the availability. I mean, we probably could break that out within our closed loss projects as a whole separate category, because so many companies that's driving their process. Where is available capacity in the next 12 to 18 months? As obviously a lot of people know that the lead times across the entire country for electrical infrastructure has really been drawn out, particularly since early last year. So that's something where we saw a significant number of projects that were very narrowly focused on where available electrical infrastructure was at, as they were looking to take down where there was excess capacity. But that's probably something that I can't underscore the importance of working very closely with your electrical partners, sort of have those conversations, set baseline expectations of what's possible or not, and whether or not, I mean, because increasingly we're having projects that are filtered through that lens exclusively early on and often. So that's something that is top of mind for us, and will continue to be, because obviously you look at the load forecast growth, and I mean, Duke Energy, for example, I forgot the most recent numbers that they filed in regards to the integrated resources plan, but in conversations with the Duke team, we're constantly seeing that uptick, as it's a lot of that's industrial related, but increasingly, obviously, something that's not captured in our pipeline as much, that obviously Duke primarily deals with in our state, is sort of the interest in data centers, and sort of that being, I mean, obviously you read about AI, you read about cloud computing, you read over the past few months about how that's going to continue to grow in the interest of that. So it's definitely impacting our work on a day-to-day basis more than it ever has, and I don't foresee that stopping anytime soon.
Right. Agree. Austin, if you were a developer, what size building would you build, and including the ceiling height?
So we definitely know where you're contemplating building a building, but I think there's probably some conversations we can have offline with folks, because obviously I would point to, hey, where's the data at, and what's like our median size request? But obviously, depending on your community, size of your community, what you're seeing as far as success, because I feel like most often what we see a lot of communities do, and a lot of the communities that sort of build out their own industrial parks or have well-established spec program, ultimately, what you build out needs to be reflective of what the needs of your local community are. And what we obviously provide here is just sort of a high level what we're seeing at the states, but there's pretty strong distinctions about how different communities have set up really strong programs that sort of reflect the needs of what they're seeing in their local industrial market. But if you however just default to be like, okay, well, here's our data, and what we're seeing, the vast majority of what we're seeing is obviously that 50 to 200,000 square foot range of building in our pipeline.
Yeah, and when I talk to local brokers in the area, they tend to agree that it can be very market driven, so it could be different sizes in different areas of the state, if you will, and what other amenities you might have in your specific region. So, okay, so what corridors of the state or what markets are you actually seeing the most interest in North Carolina?
So for us, I mean, the really encouraging thing I would say, over the past few years, due to how our project mix has changed, where it's more primary manufacturing, and even more than it was, obviously pre-COVID. I mean, I think we obviously see a lot of activity around our largest market. So it's obvious that people ask about Raleigh, they ask about Charlotte, they ask about Greensboro, what's in Salem, They also ask oftentimes about fast growing markets in part of the state. So wanting to see where demographically places are doing extremely well. And obviously there is the places most often are in around those parts of the state, but obviously got a lot of activity and growth in Wilmington, and increasingly along that 85 corridor, which are obviously the traditional parts of the state that see a disproportionate amount of announcements. But I think increasingly what I would say I've seen over the past 18 months is with some of the unique needs of these projects, our best location options are oftentimes in more rural parts of our state. So there's a number of sites that have seen a lot of interest because of their available infrastructure, whether or not that's power, water, wastewater. And sometimes it's due to obviously the decline of industry where that community is well situated, or they thought through really proactively, strategically about what they're targeting and able to be well positioned for what our project pipeline is right now. But increasingly, I think I'm proud to say we're seeing good activity across a lot of parts of the state, but obviously the traditional areas that are oftentimes in the news are doing well and continue to do well.
Right. So do you see private ownership as an issue? Does it come up, or how are you all handling that?
So when you say private ownership,
Like of the building or the site, I imagine.
yeah. So on our end, one thing that we sometimes run into is with private ownership across the state is sometimes they have a very strong stance of only wanting to lease. And obviously we see a lot of manufacturers of pipeline where there's just not a real openness to do that. So there's a few places sometimes where, there was so much industrial real estate activity in 21 and 22, so much private sector drawing down land that really has impacted, I think in many times our site options. I mean, increasingly when our team looks at where site options are at in the state, I'm oftentimes surprised about the limited inventory out there. And oftentimes I'd say we don't track it in our pipeline, but we get asked to do second or third searches just to make sure we're not missing anything, because one or two additional site options for a client can really put us in play. And there's been some cases though recently where that's been helpful for us. And obviously everybody's extremely busy in our line of work, where sometimes where you get these extremely tight deadlines, you may read in between, I don't think I'm the best fit or not. So I would encourage people to reach out to our team to understand, hey, we got this unique real estate option. Is it worth submitting or not? I think that's one thing our team always welcomes, to sort of get feedback from what they're seeing as far as what options are we receiving. And that sort of goes to when you're wondering about like, hey, how private development is sort of impacting our line of work. It's increasingly drawn down the number of our site options, because most often they're maybe more geared towards some of that strong activity interest there was across e-commerce fulfillment centers, which oftentimes those companies are not driven by a truly competitive site selection process. So I'm really interested to see how much of that land sort of reverts back, or there's more of an openness to maybe sell it in the future. So if anybody's interested in advancing those conversations, we're always interested, because oftentimes it's one of those things where they're saying this, but they're maybe willing to consider this for the right client, et cetera. But it's definitely impacted, particularly along the 85 corridor, and even really heightened expectations. Similar to I think the residential housing market, increasingly we found industrial developers that have saw really good prices being accepted in 22, and they're unwilling to come down though right now because they're still chasing that 22 industrial market. But obviously industrial's extremely strong in our state and will continue to be. So I'm interested to see how much that reverts back to opportunity for some of our projects.
Right. And just so the attendees know, I'm skipping around a little bit with the questions because I feel like Austin has just organically answered a few of these and other remarks. So I think he's touched on utility availability. He's also touched on data center, a little bit about the pipeline of that. So I'm just skipping around a little bit. So forgive me if I'm not going in order or I haven't gotten to your question. Here's one that's comes up a couple times that I've heard recently as well. But from an EDPNC's perspective, how or is housing playing a role when you're speaking to prospects?
So I would say housing is one of those things that we're increasingly seeing being asked about as a company gets further into their site selection process, and they're looking to firmly understand how's the community immediately addressing that need, or what are they seeing as far as new permits in their pipeline. as well as regionally speaking, when they're looking at their 45-minute drive time or their 60-minute drive time, where are the places that they're going to potentially pull in from that have the momentum where they're seeing private sector development interest in housing. So it's been increasingly a part of the conversations we have as people look holistically about, how ultimately are they going to find their workers for the short and long term. So it's something I could point to a few projects I've worked over the past 18 months where it's been a significant part once they've got pretty far down the pathway and they're trying to make distinctions about their level of comfort with a community in a region, because most often it comes up housing in, hey, we're more in a tertiary or secondary market. We're sort of just outside. We think we have the ability to pull from that larger market, but we still want the certainty that there's not just a desert where there is no housing being developed. So I'll just point to, there's obviously some communities across the state that are not as pro-development. And those places are noted when companies are going through their site selection process as far as like, hey, why does that desert exist? Is that a result of just not interest in the area or just et cetera? So housing as well as, childcare is top of mind as well. Those are two items that increasingly we get asked about in more detail than we probably did 24 months ago.
Right.
Just being prepared to speak to that, to understand. Oftentimes we're increasingly having to incorporate community tours where they see these developments apart from just the map or sort of passed along to them at high level information.
Right. Yeah, it's amazing some of the things that they weren't part of the conversation 5 or 10 years ago, but they certainly are now. So when you are speaking with site location consultants, site location selectors, is the issue of labor or utility availability, is that a leading question that you're seeing?
Is that a what question? I'm sorry.
Is it like a leading question? So when you're talking with site location consultants, the topic of labor and the topic of utilities, is that a leading question or is it somewhere further down in the conversation?
It is a leading question. It varies most often whether or not, most often for the utilities related question, they're most often asking for more of our assistance and role in supporting that. Where with the labor information, oftentimes when a project gets sent to us, there's been some level of due diligence where they sometimes maybe have more familiarity with the labor markets that they're maybe specifically targeting. But that's for the subset of projects that come into us and they ask for maybe preset geographic areas or preset, hey, we need to be X amount of distance from international airport. There's still a lot of those projects in our pipeline that come to us and they're just asking for us to cast it across the entire state. And in those cases, that's where we have a more instrumental role in getting good local information about the workforce needs, about initiatives in their community from their talent pipeline, from K through 12 through their partnerships with community colleges and universities in the area. So, but yes, those are leading questions that we're getting and things oftentimes we're solving from the onset of our engagement with projects. And we get asked for more and more nuanced information as widely speaking, particularly on labor, there's more good resources that are more readily available for people. So oftentimes they come with more detailed questions for us, or they're looking to complement what they read about, what they've been given with, hey, can you connect us with a few companies in your area? Can you connect us with some good ally or organizations that sort of work with those companies to sort of get a sense of from a few different ways of what people are seeing in the labor market. So that's one thing I can't underscore enough is to make sure when it comes to workforce, you've really got some people you can reach out to that can tell that story in addition to yourself and your community college, being able to bolster the number of partners that can speak effectively and giving a number of ways where they can provide insight is really important because that just really eases people's comfort with ultimately communities. But
right,
yeah,
they want to hear from the experts, right? So we have just about 2 minutes left, Austin, and we have 2 quick questions. So you've touched on these both a little bit, but maybe you can give us just a 30-second answer or so. So regarding the data center industry, are you seeing any upticks there with regarding projects looking at the state, the data center industry? Is there an uptick?
Yes, we've seen a major uptick. We speak regularly to our partners at Duke Energy most often, the ones that are getting those direct inquiries, and they would say it's skyrocketed over the past 12 to 18 months with interest. This, for background, the state's involvement with data centers is really unique, where oftentimes our benefits to companies are statutory in nature, and most often they're not looking to go through a discretionary incentive process. And they're so tied to the availability of power, which is why they have to speak to Duke. They're also obviously have to work very closely with the local community to ensure their support for data centers. Because obviously the state's pretty unique, where going back to 15 plus years ago, we've got a number of communities that have got sites for all the typical data center companies that are top of mind when you're talking about Google, Facebook, Amazon, et cetera, that are serving those. And then we still have statutory benefits on our books. So that's the one thing increasingly we're getting asked by companies directly or data center developers is what's the state sort of appetite and what are your local communities' appetite for data centers? So I'd say that's one thing, just if you're a community, just to make sure you know what your local community sort of perspective on that, willingness sort of explore that or not as you work with your utility provider. But yes, I think it takes up a disproportionate amount of times, I think, of some of our utility partners' time on a daily basis, particularly around those sites that are well situated to serve some of those clients and sort of their needs.
Exactly, exactly. And then real quick, last question. So regarding incentives, when you're having those conversations with the companies, what kind of feedback are you getting as far as rating state incentives versus local incentives?
So it really varies upon the project. I mean, the more capital intensive the project is, I mean, I always think of like, what's the spectrum of like jobs versus investment, and they tilted in one direction or another, because obviously if it's very high jobs with low capital investment, they're most often looking heavily to the state to and what their incentive package looks like, where on the opposite end, low number of jobs, high capital investments is that much more important for what the local community support is going to be. So it really varies from a project perspective, like what the project is. But I'd say one thing increasingly that companies are really looking at are like, not only are you going to support us with incentives, but like, do you want us, or are you going to really work alongside of us? Because for a lot of companies that are going through this process that are in that energy and EV space, they're doing maybe their first facility, their second or third facility, and they're in really competitive landscape. I mean, they've always been, but it's even more important when you're that early stage of a company. It's sort of really commercializing your plans. And they just want to make sure that, hey, there's one thing to be supportive of discretionary incentives, but increasingly our conversations where we bring in DEQ in regards to how the state handles permitting across the apparatus. What does our support look like with DOT? How does the local community prepare to say they're going to outline their support for, permitting, inspections, having some type of resource they can go to help them, post announcement. Those things are increasingly really important to outline what's that overall support look like, in addition to what people think of when they think traditionally of incentives, discretionary incentive programs that are available, But yeah, I think that's one thing that we've definitely seen that's really important for communities to be able to articulate, in addition to just those normal things. Communities place a high premium on how are you going to work with us on the workforce? How are you going to work with us just getting operation up? And increasingly, they want to say, similar to workforce, it's how have you done this for other companies in your area? Like, is this new to you, or do you have something you can point to that gives us comfort and assurance that you're going to be able to successfully work with us, and we can be strong partners?
Right. Well, Austin, we are coming to the end of our time. This has been a great webinar. Lots of good information, lots of great questions from the participants. But again, that slide deck will be available. But thank you again, Austin, for sharing your insights and your experiences and your advice today. We really appreciate you taking the time to do that. NCEDA's partnership with EDPNC continues to help us provide resources and education to our membership that benefits the overall economic growth for the state. And it also paves the way for businesses to innovate and thrive globally. So before we go, I'd like to again thank our annual sponsors. We could not do this without you. I would like to remind you that I'd like to remind you all of some of our upcoming events. Join us for our Triad area luncheon in High Point on May 22nd. And mark your calendars for our always highly anticipated and always fun 2024 annual conference that will take place in Wilmington from June 25th to June 27th. So please, the registration is open now. So please look at that and sign up for all the events there. And you'll see more information on that. More details can be found in our bi-weekly newsletter, our e-newsletter that goes out, and also on the NCEDA website. So again, thanks everybody for being here, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care.